Professor, you said a lot of wonderful things about China, and surely they're doing a lot of things right. But how do you reconcile the fact that to make it work for China, it seems to be based on a high level of repression, environmental destruction, censorship, a certain ideological stubbornness? I mean, we've spoken about Hong Kong, the Uyghurs. How do you reconcile that, and why do you think that's? I mean, do you think that's tolerable?
Thank you. I'm really glad you asked that question, because your question captured very well the Anglo-Saxon media's perception of China. And I would suggest to you very bluntly that it's a distorted perspective of reality. Let's take the first word you use, repression. If the Communist Party of China only relied on repression to stay in power, it would not create the most dynamic economy in the world, right? It is by far the most dynamic economy in the world. It has delivered the fastest growing economy for 30 years. And it has done this by educating the Chinese people to a level and extent that the Chinese people have never been educated ever before. And you say it's repression. You obviously are taking the old Cold War mindset. I was in Moscow in 1976, and I saw repression in Moscow. And when I was in Moscow, the Soviet citizens were not allowed to travel outside the Soviet Union. That's repression. In the year 2019, 139 million Chinese left China freely. Guess what? Zero defectors. 139 million Chinese, right? That's twice the population of the UK. Went back to China. So all your description, when you say environmental degradation, China's climate change policies are far more responsible than those of the United States, which has not once, but twice withdrawn from global environmental protocols. Kyoto Protocol, the Bush administration left 8 years. Paris Accords, Trump administration left 4 years. And you know what? The reason why we're having climate change today is not because of new flows of greenhouse gas emissions from China and India. It's because of what the Western countries have put in the atmosphere since the Western Industrial Revolution. Get the data. The single largest contributor, cumulatively, right, is number 1, United States, number 2, Europe, number 3, China. Right? And the West wants China to pay an economic price for the current flows, but the West doesn't want to pay an economic price for what it put in the atmosphere. You want to deprive the Indians of electricity when the United States could just, by the way, if the United States could impose $1 a gallon tax, that would save the world. Cut down gasoline consumption, raise money for investment in green technology. Simple solutions. And by contrast, the largest reforestation program in the world is carried out by China. It has already reforested an area the size of Belgium or bigger, right? So all your descriptions capture the natural distortions of China that you get in the Anglo-Saxon media, which violate the rules of the Enlightenment, which say that you must be rational, calm, and objective, especially in understanding your adversary. And if the Chinese were as stupid and as incompetent as you describe them to be, don't worry about them. But I can assure you, you are now dealing with a far more intelligent and rational actor that doesn't fit any of the Anglo-Saxon categories that you applied to them. Please forgive my bluntness.
Now you're putting words into my mouth.
My response to that, I'm glad you mentioned Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a very typical example of how the misunderstanding arises between the West and China and the United States and China. Now, I want to go back to my point about there are 193 countries in the world. And of the countries that are concerned about Hong Kong, I guarantee you, almost no African country is interested in Hong Kong, right? I do not know of, maybe except for Japan, any other Asian country that speaks out on Hong Kong. In fact, you mentioned India. In this book, Has China Won?, I tell a story of how, I think in 1961 or 62, President John F. Kennedy of United States and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of United Kingdom wrote a letter to the Anglophile Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, and said, hey, we understand you're going to invade Goa. Don't invade Goa, please. Let Portugal run Goa. I think within a week or two of receiving the letter, Nehru invaded Goa, took back Goa, and said Goa belongs to India, please. So in the same way as Nehru thinks that Goa belongs to India, Chinese think that Hong Kong belongs to China. And as far as I know, apart from the Western countries, in no other, out of the 193 countries in the world, take out the Western countries, the remaining countries don't say anything about Hong Kong. And also, this is another important statistic, only 12% of the world's population lives in the West. 88% lives outside the West. So in terms of your point about does China listen to opinions, I think the Chinese pay attention to the 88% figure. And I think that's what is missing in the Anglo-Saxon media, an incapacity to understand that 88%, the thinking of the 88%.
If you look at what China's actions are in the region, yes, they are moving forward on economic integration, but they've also been, you and I have debated whether the word should be assertive or aggressive, but look at their actions in Hong Kong. Look at China's actions in the militarization of the South China Sea. Look at China's actions on the border with India. Look at what China's, we can say whether they're provocative or not, but certainly China's actions went with regards to Taiwan. So where do you see the region looking at China versus the region, when I mean region, Asia ex-China looking at China versus the United States?
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised these points because they make an important point that I think all investors should understand. If you are going to understand this region through the lenses of the Anglo-Saxon media, you will completely misunderstand what's happening in East Asia because they have a very jaundiced black and white view of what is happening here. I mean, you take the first example you mentioned, Hong Kong. It's such a big deal in the Anglo-Saxon media. Name me one Asian country that's saying anything about Hong Kong. As far as the Asians are concerned, Hong Kong was a British colony that was illegally seized by the British in the humiliating Opium War of 1842. China's are just rectifying a huge historical humiliation by taking back Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is just part of China, right? So that's the reality. In the same way that Goa is part of India, right? So it's important, therefore, if you keep reading the Anglo-Saxon media, you get a completely distorted view in what, and this is an important point again to emphasize, okay? There's the world's population is 7.8 billion people. There are 1.4 billion people in China, 1.3 billion people in India, 700 million in ASEAN. And this is what I call the new CIA, China, India, ASEAN. These will be the three major growth engines of the world. And guess what? You read the Anglo-Saxon media, you'll never understand the CIA and what's happening in this region. And let me give you one statistic. Between 2010 and 2020, let me ask you a simple question. The European Union has a combined GNP of $15 trillion. ASEAN has only got $3 trillion. In the 10 years between 2010 and 2020, who contributed more to global economic growth? Was it the European Union or was it ASEAN? And the answer is ASEAN. And nobody knows anything about ASEAN. So what you have here in this region is a culture of pragmatism that is preventing wars like Ukraine that's going to drag down the United States and EU. You keep on fighting wars, we keep on trading. And the Anglo-Saxon media will never tell you that this is all happening in this region.